and welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast, the show that aims to reduce the innovation to implementation gap to 16 and a half years. I'm your host, Mike Pullman, and with co-host Kevin King, we think today's show will be pretty thought-provoking. Today, we'll have a conversation with a collection of some of the greatest minds in implementation science about the operationalization of the two most important constructs in implementation science, interventions and implementation strategies. Sounds easy, right? In the 20-odd years that implementation science has been around, we figured this out, haven't we? Not really. Today's show is a recording from an informal discussion of a council of experts including Aaron Lyon, Bryan Weiner, Cara Lewis, Pedja Klasnja, Byron Powell, Shannon Dorsey, Rosemary Meza, and Kevin King. Let's get started. Before we launch into the show, I'm going to use my platform as a host to say a few things. While at first glance it may seem easy to define interventions and implementation strategies as constructs, upon probing things quickly fall apart. The problem is, an intervention is actually not a thing, though that definitely is a useful analogy at times, so please don't abandon it. Interventions don't have a shape or a substance, you can't hold on to them like you can with things, but they rather are processes that unfold, often iteratively and dynamically. Because implementation science emerged from a professional-centric worldview, the field has traditionally considered interventions as something that professionals perform. But what if the intervention is digitally delivered, or is a self-help book, or is delivered by a caregiver? Let's say there's an intervention delivered by a professional who is trained by the intervention developer, and that same intervention developer writes a self-help book for people to use the intervention on their own. Are these the same or different interventions? Is the self-help book an intervention on its own, or is it an implementation strategy for the intervention? Classical implementation science, which is, again, centered on professionals delivering interventions, would say the book is not the same intervention, but I'm not so sure. Similarly, implementation strategies can be hard to pin down. Intervention characteristics such as their simplicity and ease of use are also implementation strategies. Because implementation science is multi-leveled and because it turns the lens on itself, sometimes it becomes a hall of mirrors. And ultimately, does any of this even matter? And if so, why? Well, let's hear our conversation with the experts. The UW Alacrity Center has been focused on creating methods to help people redesign interventions and implementation strategies to improve them, and it provides small grants to research projects to use those methods. So the center has been grappling with an issue that we're going to discuss today. We've been working with our awardees to code intervention and implementation usability issues, solutions, and adaptations made to implement solutions. And we've had some disagreement about what constitutes an adaptation to the intervention versus an adaptation to the implementation strategy, or both. So the usual challenge is something like this. A project will use human-centered design methods to digitize like behavioral activation for depression, and it keeps the elements of behavioral activation the same in terms of its function, but it changes like the interactivity of it. So maybe it puts it online so that people can access a worksheet in a little bit slightly different formats, or something of that nature. So some of us, including the awardees, feel intuitively that this is a change to the implementation strategy, but others feel that it's a change to the intervention. And some people would say kind of that it's both, that it means it's, but that would mean that it's always both. And that might be fine, but it kind of isn't very satisfying from a science perspective because, at its heart, the foundation of positivist science is that constructs are real and that those constructs can be measured and delineated and defined and operationalized. So it feels a little uncomfortable to come up against the difficulty in defining two of the most central constructs of implementation science, which are interventions and implementation strategies. That's kind of the overarching layout of it. But I'd be curious about Aaron, whether you want to provide some additional context, or if not, if you just kind of want to launch us here.
I mean, maybe just the additional things I'll say, which might be more launching than necessarily context. This is something we've been trying to do at the UW Alacrity Center from the beginning. We realized, of course, that it was not always clear to the different teams what they were doing, in part because of just sort of the gray between intervention and implementation strategy. We also picked up on, not surprisingly, I think a certain amount of vested interests in stating that a team isn't changing the intervention because of an underlying assumption that we've tried to address but keeps resurfacing no matter how explicit we think we are about it, that changing an intervention or doing some sort of adaptation of an intervention falls across a really broad spectrum. And sometimes those changes might impact the mechanisms or the function or the extent to which something could still be delivered with fidelity, and sometimes it doesn't. And we've tried to sort of separate the like any statements or decisions about what was being adapted and keep that sort of agnostic to whether something was changed in such a meaningful way that it would require revalidation and another RCT or something like that. I think a lot of the distinction and the struggle that we've had within the Alacrity Center hinges a little less on, is it an intervention or is it a strategy that's being adapted, and more whether or not people are comfortable with it being an intervention that was adapted. And I think sometimes they default to strategy because they're like, well, we didn't change the function of the intervention. It must be a strategy. And I think I just want to acknowledge intervention adaptation to increase implementation outcomes is a strategy. And that's totally fine. And in that sense, say like in the UW Alacrity Center, everything we're doing is that strategy. Okay, that's fine. But that's deeply unsatisfying to simply stop there, right? I think the one other thing that has come up across a lot of our teams, because so many of them, maybe half, have a kind of digital technology component, I've become increasingly staunch in my perspective that simply digitizing intervention content does not a strategy make. Yeah, maybe that's all. I mean, at the end of the day, we of course also begin to question whether or not any of this actually matters at all. But we think that based on the audiences we want to be able to speak to and speak with, that it is going to matter, especially if you look at things like some of the criteria that implementation science tends to apply, just to whether or not something is within scope. And intervention, adaptation, or redesign has pretty explicitly been placed out of scope. So if that is a reflection of the field in any way, shape, or form, then it's certainly something that we need to grapple with. That's what I got.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't understand why the distinction matters. Can somebody just help me understand, just from an outsider?
I think some of it is the history of implementation science coming up, like growing out of intervention science failures, I think, in a lot of ways, and needing to attend to something different than simply the intervention, and making that as explicit as possible, giving birth to the notion of and focus on implementation strategies.
Yeah, and so the thought I have on that is that I sort of feel like the thing that implementation science seems to have identified is that there are no pure interventions, right? That they're not, at least in terms of the psychosocial stuff that most of us truck in, there's every intervention is set in a context. And so even the sort of pure original trial that test mechanisms and whatever, like they're seated within a structural mechanism, a recruitment of participants mechanism, an implementation mechanism, or content. I mean, I guess that's all the setting stuff, right? I can never get that stuff straight. So to me, I guess I'm struggling. Is it sort of like, oh, well, the way we want to talk to like Edna Foas of the world, the original implementation, the original intervention developers, and whether we're saying to them, we're changing a program or not. I don't know. Again, maybe that's a dumb question, but I just sort of, I guess I wondered sort of what's the benefit to the science and what's the benefit to the social aspect of the science?
this is sort of a answer to question Kevin's point, but then it's also sort of the way I've been thinking about this. I love Jeff Curran's simple language tools, the thing we want to implement and the aspects or strategies or ways we need to support the organization, system, state, people in doing them. And I've just wondered if that's a way for us to think about this discussion. But, you know, Kevin, to your point, I probably care less about the science in the fields, but I care the most about how do we help implement things that they have population health impact. And I like Jeff Curran's language because I think it helps people understand, okay, yeah, you've got an intervention, you've got something you want to do. It's a mental health intervention, but we've got to also have things that help people do that thing. So I think in terms of supporting successful implementation, and I don't mean the science of implementation, but successful, you know, use of an innovation or a thing in Curran's language, to me, that's a helpful discussion to be able to have with people to get the outcomes they want. And I'll stop there.
So couple of comments. One is, I mean, just even going back to the literature on the placebo effect and sort of influence of expectations on sort of on what we typically consider biological interventions, you know, pharmaceuticals, surgery, things of that sort. There's still quite strong evidence that how those things are done. So who is giving a pill, right? Whether it's a physician or whether a physician has an effect, right? So the thing that has an effect is the whole package that is being deployed, that including the context, the social context, the cultural context, expectancies, and so on. And so to my mind, and I'm especially since I mostly deal with mobile health, like the package of all of this stuff and how it is a massive part of what produces an effect. And so I've always had a difficult time between distinguishing with what's the active ingredient and what's all of this stuff that is just sort of moderating the effect of that active ingredient, partly because those interactions are so intertwined. And again, that goes even as far as biological treatments. And so in psychosocial treatments, I assume that is even much more the case, even much more so. And so I guess one question is, there's sort of disciplinary issues around why maybe some of these distinctions matter. To me, a bigger issue is just like what are the things that are needed to make something work, right? Be effective. And some of those things are going to be at the level of what we can, you know, consider intervention. Other things are going to be at the level of this sort of wrapper around that stuff that we typically refer to as strategies. But I'm not sure that in any given case, there's all that much at stake of where you draw that line, kind of where the intervention stops and where the strategy starts.
I was just going to add that when I started working at KP and saw more health system, health services researchers in action, helping them think about how to test in other settings or what to scale, when they were defining their intervention as this mix of the clinical intervention and implementation strategies, at least the way I saw it, it became harder to scale. And so we went through the thought exercise of, what's the intervention that you're trying to get into play? What are the things that helped you make that happen here? Are those necessarily going to be even available in other community settings to scale? And even if they are available, are they necessary? Or could you kind of work backwards and think through what were the barriers that those strategies were intended to address, or what implementation outcomes were those, you know, intending to achieve? And so that was another sort of practical reason for this exercise.
That makes a lot of sense to me. What I'm not sure that leads to is this clear distinction between strategies and intervention. Like, because I think some of the stuff that you say, what are the barriers that might be addressable through other means in a different setting, could potentially just be other active ingredients that are needed for the whole thing to work, right? I mean, and so I don't know that it's. I mean, I think for something like screening, these distinctions are pretty simple. Like if you know, a cancer screening, there's a single form that needs to be done, whatever, right? I mean, I think that there are cases where one can make these distinctions pretty clean. And with psychosocial interventions, I think it becomes much harder.
I think one area where things fall apart is when we think about interventions solely as the functions that it produces and sort of the processes by which, the mechanisms by which it produces those functions. So let's take cognitive behavioral therapy as an example. And so a therapist can deliver cognitive behavioral therapy. But what happens when somebody reads a self-help book that uses cognitive behavioral therapy skills written by a therapist, and it's not being administered by the therapist anymore? And here I'm genuinely confused, because reading a book, self-help skills, that's not in our list of implementation strategies. The implementation strategies that we focused on so far are largely focused on getting professional healthcare deliverers to do a thing. But what happens when it's the person doing the thing? I think of that as an implementation strategy. I think they're still doing the intervention, cognitive behavioral therapy, but now it's a book, or maybe they're doing it online with an AI assistant or some other thing. But it's still cognitive behavioral therapy with a series of steps. But I'd really love to hear Byron's thoughts on this, and maybe it's a little bit of history about how the implementation strategies, list developed might even be useful for that.
I'm not sure if I have any brilliant insights on that. But to me, like, that example goes back to what Aaron posed, is like, would you need another randomized controlled trial to demonstrate the effectiveness of that intervention or strategy? And when I hear that on the face of it, I would immediately say, like, yes, you would need to show me that that's an effective intervention or delivery of CBT. And I would not necessarily think of that as an implementation strategy, because the mechanisms that you're after are still related to mental health primarily, and not necessarily, I mean, it might be a more implementable or widely scalable form of an intervention. But if I was sitting in a study section and that came across and they said, CBT is effective, we have this new implementation strategy to deliver it, and we're going to try it, like, I wouldn't think of that immediately as an evidence-based practice, which, I don't know if others differ on that, but maybe that's a starker contrast than I've had a similar thing with CBT with a K mentee who's applying for a K, and, doing something like Friendship Bench or one of these interventions that probably Shannon or others know more about than I, where it's like people are just saying CBT is widely effective, and so these are different ways of implementing it, and sort of the question coming up, can you assume that that's evidence-based, or do we need more, efficacy or effectiveness trials to establish that, versus can we jump right to a hybrid 3, for instance? So I'm not sure, but I would have trouble buying that.
And within our center, there's a whole lot of different degrees of, if you considered Mike's example to be an adaptation of CBT, we often toss it back to the teams to kind of make their own decision about what would be so significant a change that it might require that sort of thing. And again, but we try to stay agnostic to that when we're just kind of cataloging what was changed. So I feel like even that sort of having the decision between, is this an intervention redesign versus an implementation strategy redesign, hinge on that might not necessarily even be the best path. We try to sort of describe what are they doing, rather than was the change so meaningful that it would, based on people with in-depth theoretical and practical and other kinds of knowledge, sort of make a decision that it's so different that the evidence doesn't apply, right? And I think it's related, but I also think it's sort of a separate question in some ways. I mean, to me, turning CBT into a book and disseminating it that way doesn't seem like the same intervention at all. And I think Cara pointed out that's more of a dissemination strategy, arguably, than an implementation strategy.
Well, I mean, on that CBT question, you see people who get trained in CBT or CT treated very differently depending on who they get it from. So you see people come out of DBT and they're just using worksheets, right, to do cognitive reframing. But when there's other ways of training in CT or CBT where it's really like about the live questioning and interaction, and the worksheets are just sort of like homework. And is that the same intervention? And then it's like you take it one step further, and then it's a book, and you're doing cognitive restructuring, but you're learning about, and it's like all self-learning and worksheets. I don't know, maybe that's too esoteric, but I feel like I've seen that live. And where's the distinction about whether it's the same or it's not, or a dissemination strategy?
Brian, would love to hear what you have to say.
Just to carry this example through, I think a good question to ask that may shed light on this is, what is the motivation or rationale or aim for turning CBT into a book form? If the goal is to make CBT more accessible, to people or more affordable to people, then it seems to me that converting the form in which the intervention is being delivered is an implementation strategy, because it's designed to improve an implementation outcome, reach, access, implementation cost, or delivery cost, or something like that. And so the motivation for why you're doing that, I think, is important, and to be able to distinguish whether an adaptation is an intervention adaptation or an intervention, a strategy component of it, has something to do with sort of what is the intention or rationale, and is this intended to improve its effectiveness or its influence on a health outcome or health behavior, or is it intended to improve reach or fidelity by simplifying it in some ways, or some other sort of implementation outcome. And sometimes a change can affect both. Sometimes it doesn't. And this is how I've thought about a lot of sort of digital or mHealth kind of applications. Are we simply converting the form in which the thing is being delivered for the purposes of making it easier for people to use and so forth? Or are we adding, when we move things into a digital format, does digitizing it enable other intervention functions or capabilities that make it more effective? So that's in part text messaging is one, seems like to me more of an implementation strategy, because the information that's being collected isn't being changed. But if your weight loss app has goal setting features or other sorts of components to it that enhance the effectiveness of the app, that those adaptations, I think, are intervention adaptations.
Yeah, I think the idea of classification for the sake of classification or the sake of distinguishing constructs doesn't seem particularly meaningful to me here. And I think, building on what Bryan's saying here, the question of why do we need to make this distinction, and coming back to what are we trying to achieve here? And even thinking about Cara's example in the healthcare system, what is it that these teams feel needs to change? Do they think that the improvement to the patient's life needs to change? And then thinking about what are our various levers to actually do that. We might have some levers that are related to the clinical innovation itself that can do that, but we also might have some levers that might be related to things that we consider implementation strategies that also have these trickle-down effects as well. And so I think trying to have the starting place be, let's put these into different buckets without thinking about the why we need these things to be in different buckets, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think the classification system could look different depending on the reason why you're differentiating between these things. And I think this is why with many of the classification systems that we've used in implementation science have tended to not be useful depending on what your purpose is, what you're trying to figure out. So as an example, just the other day, I was trying to look at some of the classifications we've used for implementation strategies that we've put in particular buckets. And, one of them around like developing stakeholder interrelations. In some way, for some people, that's going to be useful some of the time. For the reason that I came to it with, it wasn't useful at all for the information that I was trying to glean from that. So I think starting at the end point of why are we trying to disentangle these, and acknowledging that there is fuzziness. I think trying to have these very crisp and distinct categories is unlikely, and that's probably not satisfying. But I think the reality is there is overlap there. And I think Bryan's example and this example of interventions being based on like books that consumers are reading, I think is a really nice example of how it all depends on what you're trying to answer there. And there absolutely can be implementation. You can view it as an implementation strategy.
I think part of this also has to do with how well we actually understand the mechanisms that are influencing the health outcomes. So again, going back to this example of biologicals, because we think we know the mechanisms there. So you have, let's say, a hypertension drug, where we have a model of the molecular action through which this thing is supposed to reduce hypertension. Typically, the trials with this are done where you have cardiologists prescribing them and whatnot, and you get an effect size, right? You could potentially think that, okay, maybe just to increase the reach, we should let physician assistants prescribe hypertension drugs as well. Mechanism that we normally consider is not changed in this case. The same pill is being prescribed. However, again, there's actually a fair bit of literature showing that who is providing the drug can make a difference, and the mechanisms involved end up having to do with trust, having to do with expectations, and the authority of the person being provided. And you could, if you ran another trial, find out that when physician assistant is actually providing the drug, it is less effective. Normally, we would have considered that a implementation strategy, task shifting, you're just increasing access. But in fact, it is also changing the mechanism of action, which is changing to what extent it's engaging the patient's trust and expectation of improvement. And so I think that some of these distinctions are sometimes deceptively clear. We might think that it's actually clear that we're just doing task shifting because the intervention itself, the pill is not being changed. But in fact, there are additional mechanisms that are getting engaged or not being engaged under the new regime. That if we're not thinking about it, it's very easy to just not consider.
When Byron mentioned, you might want to get another trial if someone was changing an intervention in a certain way, like, if someone was going to do friendship bench or something in a slightly different way. I was just going to say there's a tradition in treatment development that is very narrow. And I think they've even still used designs that we have much better designs to test interventions now. And they're always focused on effect size, not on any of the other things like reach and other things. And I worry that, if we get held back by things that the treatment development field over cares about, like always an RCT or always an effect size and any tiny change. But I realize that we sometimes feel like we're held to that field, but I wish we weren't. And I feel like that's a problem in some ways. So that was the thing I was saying earlier. The other thing I just wanted to make sure and get out there is, as folks who write implementation science papers and have implementation science funded centers, I want to also call out that we may be over likely to want to call things implementation strategies than treatment development, because say something makes something really work, right? And it's a treatment change. Is there a chance that we sometimes overly want to say, no, that's in the implementation space because those grants are funded and they're called implementation grants? Sometimes treatment changes are the best thing in the world, and it could have nothing to do with implementation. So I just wanted to call that out because that's always going to be a lens that might affect how we as a group might see things. And I think we have to guard against that.
We're often pushing some of our investigators who are reporting on what they're doing in their projects to say more that they are redesigning interventions than implementation strategies. They sort of default to implementation strategies, I think, because it gets so muddled. And I think what's really muddled is the fact that redesigning an intervention, like I was saying earlier, for the purposes of implementation is an implementation strategy. But the thing that they're redesigning is not the implementation strategy. Like they're enacting an implementation strategy by redesigning an intervention, but they're not redesigning the implementation strategy. If they were redesigning the implementation strategy, they would be redesigning the process of redesign. I don't want to think about that. So I think driven by the sort of history and the narrowness and, often rigidity, I think, of intervention science, I think people are very hesitant to acknowledge that they're redesigning the intervention because so many people in their training traditions have had it drilled into them that that's unacceptable.
I think this distinction is absolutely essential for us to be able to distinguish two different fields of scientific inquiry. Whether it's an essential distinction for people in implementation practice is another question. I'll set that aside for a moment. But the field of implementation science really rests on this distinction between the what and the how, the thing we want to see implemented and how we get that done. And precisely because we have plenty of things that we can do to improve health outcomes or health behavior, they're not getting done in practice or done well. And to do those things, we need a different term. Thankfully, we've landed on a different term besides intervention to describe those kinds of things that we can do to help the thing get done and done well in practice. That's what implementation science cares about. And we sort of leave what we should do to our intervention science colleagues and take up this other problem, which they've largely ignored, which is how we got into this problem in the first place, by focusing on the how kinds of questions. And there are things in the world that are clearly interventions that are designed and intended and have demonstrated evidence to improve health outcomes or health behaviors. And then there are things that are clearly, meaning inarguably, implementation strategies that are designed to help people do the thing and do it well. Often those are around changing the context in which something is happening, or are directed toward changing the behaviors of the intervention deliverers. So training, audit and feedback, opinion leaders, innovation championing, fight me that those are interventions, all right? When we talk about, instead of trying to change the context or address barriers in the context, when we talk about trying to change barriers or implementation issues to the thing itself, that's where it gets a little muddy. All right, but just because one portion of this is muddy doesn't mean we throw the distinction out entirely. Where it gets muddy, and it gets muddy for a good reason, and to me, what a criterion or a way to kind of navigate this space is to understand whether when we try to adapt or change the thing that we want to have implemented, some aspect of that thing, how it's being delivered, who delivers it, when it's being delivered, in what format it's being delivered, and so forth, we have to ask ourselves, are we making this change to the thing in order to make it more effective, meaning to make it have a bigger effect on health outcomes or health behavior? Or are we doing it to help ease implementation, to increase its reach, the ease of which it can be delivered with fidelity, or the consistency or standardization of that, or the reduction in the cost of delivering it to make it more affordable to people, and so forth? And it is, like I said, it is possible that sometimes making a change to something does both. Either intentionally or unintentionally affects both implementation outcomes or health outcomes and health behavior. And that's perfectly fine. That does not mean this distinction is irrelevant. It just means that this is one of those cases where you've actually made a change that has multiple, effects, not just one. So that's kind of how I think about this and how I try to do it. It is when we talk about changing the thing, that's where this distinction is harder to make. I'm not saying is, and where sometimes it's not a distinction that matters much because it's going to affect both. And when it does affect both, or we think it might, that's where we need some evidence, because the reason why we want to do a hybrid 3 trial is we're going to implement this thing in a certain way. And it's possible that implementing in this way changes its effectiveness on the health outcomes or health behaviors, either intentionally or unintentionally, either it increases it or decreases it. And we need to know, because this change is potentially has that effect. And so we need to collect some additional evidence for that. If we're not sure, if we can make a good case, we can convince ourselves that simply digitizing this previously in-person delivered intervention is not likely to have an effect on how, on the health outcomes or health behaviors that we expect to see, then I think the argument for collecting more evidence about its effects on health is probably is also harder to make.
I'm glad you recorded that mic drop. I feel like Bryan just very succinctly explained why the UW Alacrity Center struggles with this so much, right? The reason why I think it's really important to disentangle, an additional reason, I guess, is that I really worry that if we aren't clear on which aspects are implementation strategies, we don't build the evidence of implementation strategies. We just learn that this one singular, adapted intervention works better in this way for these people, when I hope we can surface generalizable knowledge about how implementation strategies work to address what barriers and therefore could be leveraged by other implementers for other interventions and when they're facing similar barriers, if that makes sense.
Isn't that the problem I think that's a problem of generalizability that you get with interventions too, right? You're always studying one particular operationalization of intervention in one particular context, right? And so this thing about whether goal setting is effective is really an inference from many studies that have various operationalizations of goal setting with different populations, and then you're sort of inferring up to an abstract construct. And I think the same thing we can do with implementation strategies without I'm not sure that as long as one is clear about what changes are being introduced into a setting, right, then across multiple settings where that is done, one starts generating evidence. But I'm not sure that the inferential leap is any different in the context of implementation than interventions.
It's a communication. Sorry, just to finish this thought. To me, it's communication. So if scholars are reading articles and it's like, adapted CBT works in this way, and it's not calling out and testing implementation strategies, I just don't know that even gets lumped into systematic reviews in the way that we'd want to develop the science of implementation that hopefully actually helps us resolve science practice gaps beyond a single study.
One complication I think with digitizing interventions is that they may be done for the purpose of improving some sort of implementation outcome like reach or lowering costs and so forth. But, that digitizing of an intervention also is likely to impact the effectiveness of that intervention because from what I understand, there's just lower engagement with digital mental health interventions than there is with in-person ones, or at least there's the potential for that. And that lower engagement means that treatment, that effectiveness of the what that's being delivered through this alternative form is likely to be less effective or less potent. So I guess maybe Aaron and Mike, the way to think about this is folks are adapting the intervention. They may be doing this as an implementation strategy because they're doing it with the intention of trying to influence some sort of implementation outcome. But that doesn't mean that they aren't adapting the intervention. And it also doesn't mean that adaptation is purely a form change that has no effect on its potency for achieving the kind of mental health improvements that we're looking for. I'd want to check that real carefully because there's a good reason to suspect that this is not just a change in the form, that this actually changes not necessarily the function, but the potency of that because it affects people's engagement.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Aaron also argues all of the time that there is no implementation without adaptation, and we could maybe argue there is no implementation strategy without adaptation to the intervention, right? And that there's probably some impact there. That does feel a little scientifically unsatisfying to say that if that one is always kind of yoked to the other if you're doing it in that way. And it also does help me think, or raises for me some issues around, this is not a new analogy, I think, like in the world of design, but like what is adaptation in general? So we have a lot of fuzziness here. Earlier, it was brought up that, writing a book about CBT, maybe a dissemination strategy or an implementation strategy. I think Bryan argued for an implementation strategy. I'm leaning towards the implementation strategy. So there's some fuzziness there. There's fuzziness about difference between interventions and implementation strategies. And I think there's fuzziness about what makes an adaptation. So the example that we use in design, or that's used in design all the time, is like, I have a car. I get a new wheel for my car because I got a flat tire. Is that the same car? Yeah, it's the same car, and it's a different car. It's both. Like, it was adapted, but it's still the same car serving the same functions. And that's a pretty obvious example. But what if you're talking about like a hatchet, right? Where all is two parts, like a handle and and the sharp part of the hatchet, whatever that is. And you have to get a new handle. Is that the same hatchet? I don't know. It's serving the same function, but half of it is different. Right. And so when we talk about adaptations and we make those, we're getting into the fuzziness between implementation strategies and interventions, and we're getting into fuzziness around what makes an adaptation. Is it a surface adaptation? And if it's a surface adaptation, is that really an adaptation, or is that something we don't really care about? Is putting a PDF of a paper copy handout online instead of handing it to the client directly, is that an adaptation or not? Some people would say that actually that might change the function of it, and then I guess it would be kind of a deeper adaptation. But I think other people would argue it's just a surface adaptation to try to increase clients' ability to access those handouts. I don't know, a lot of stuff to think about.
So I just want to add a layer of complication from, my new role and perspective, which I'm not bringing to this conversation except for this moment. Just to acknowledge that one of the things that that is grappled with in execution of the awards, which maybe other funders are not paying as much attention to, but at what point is an implementation strategy being adapted such that your implementation trial is no longer testing the independent variables that you set out to test? And how do you make those determinations? So I don't know that we need to go there, but it's so related to what we're talking about that I wanted to raise that as a concrete example of where this kind of guidance is also useful.
Somewhat related here is, I, as somebody who works in healthcare and with more clinical evidence-based practices, I always struggle with the everything is adapted, or in adaptation we should expect, maybe even encourage adaptation, because so much of what we've tried to do in healthcare delivery, especially through quality improvement, is to reduce variation in care that's being provided. And we want to discourage adaptations by providers and deviations from clinical guidelines for this. And so there's I think a much greater emphasis on fidelity and an attempt to really reduce and discourage adaptations that we don't see on the psychosocial side of the equation. So I think that's something I've always sort of struggled with in these conversations in the field of implementation science around adaptations, not to privilege the healthcare point of view, but just to recognize that I think depending on what the intervention is or which kind of space we're working in, we can have very different sort of values or perspectives around the desirability or the inevitability of adaptations to the things that we're trying to see implemented.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that is largely moderated by really intervention complexity. And I think that sort of psychosocial versus not psychosocial is often like the biggest leap in intervention complexity, if we're sort of thinking about the entire universe of interventions or practices that might be implemented. But I do think it's important, Bryan, to make that point, because, looking at who here is in the room and our different sort of training backgrounds and the types of interventions we're focusing on most often, it is easy to conflate all interventions with the kind of complex psychosocial interventions we're most commonly dealing with.
I'm not trying to move us prematurely to any sort of synthesis, but it's fresh in my mind, a call from really a lot of experts in the field who came together, many of you, at the deep dive on was it Bainbridge? Oh, my memory. A few years ago, there was a request that the field, somebody, develop like a flow chart for deciding on, or for determining if it's an intervention or a strategy and adaptation. And I just raised that at this point of the conversation because I've heard lots of parameters, like when and why and when it's harder. And I really feel like I'd love to see that in writing from you all.
So how does all this, Aaron, how does all this sort of, what do you take away from this conversation when you think back to Alacrity and the kinds of circumstances or situations in which these questions arise?
I don't know that I've budged much, and I feel like I probably haven't budged much because I've done what human beings do, which is when those of you speak with whom I agree, I say right on, and when those of you who speak with whom I disagree, I think about all the reasons why I disagree with you. And that's not a helpful thing. And so oftentimes when I listen to things again, I can be more open to them. But it's interesting too. I've also been reflecting a little bit on sort of Zen, and which sounds a little bit weird, but Zen actually grapples with a lot of these issues about like what is something, and can we even define things, or are all things kind of like inextricably connected in an ecological kind of framework? And it's kind of an interesting thing here, because what we have here is an ecology of constructs in which the definition of one thing depends on the definition of the other, and both are expressed in terms of their functions, right? And that's exactly what ecology is. Like, how does something function within a system? And I'm thinking more deeply about sort of the system of implementation and interventions, and trying to think about that interchange, and maybe stepping a little bit away from the need to define things in a crisp way. But that makes me also feel like I'm abandoning my positivist science roots that really we're all steeped in, whether we like it or not.
Well, it is true that we never step into the same river twice. But I do think it's also important to keep the other half of that, which is to ask ourselves, is this a difference that makes a difference? And I think keeping those two perspectives, no, it may be the case, especially with non-physical interventions and psychosocial interventions that fit into this, that no intervention is delivered exactly the same way, and therefore can be considered the same intervention. The question is whether the variations are meaningful, whether those differences make a difference or not. To me, I think the language that you are using is, I think my sense of it is that folks are in Alacrity are adapting the intervention, and sometimes they're doing that as in the frame of an implementation strategy, because they have an aim in mind, an implementation outcome. They may be or they may be adapting the intervention in some way because they think they can make it more effective. And that's what they're doing for this. And then sometimes, like I said, they may be changing something, as an implementation strategy, adapting that intervention, but it could have effects on both its implementation outcomes and health outcomes or health behaviors, in which case I think those both need to be examined. But to me, that's how we label what these folks are doing, I think, is, whether you agree with me or not, is probably not the difference that makes the difference, but rather just encouraging people to attend to what's your intent in doing this, and then looking to see if there are unintended effects on the other sort of outcome that you were thinking about, because that can easily happen. Treatment engagement can be different. Changing forms may make something less potent. It could make it more potent for that in terms of its impact on health or health outcomes. And we should just be sensitive to that. I don't think you can simply substitute one form for another willy-nilly. I do think we need to be very careful about that, and to be attentive to it.
I was just going to say quickly, I like the flow chart idea, and I know you all have already kind of started a basic flow chart. I like the idea of a product that would take a lot of different examples here from different types of interventions and clinical areas, and basically set up a almost debate-like format, sort of like one person argues this is a change to the intervention versus an adaptation to the intervention versus an adaptation to the strategy versus whatever. But then also stating very clearly, why does this matter in terms of design and analysis? And also, why does this matter for patients or whatever the intended recipient is? But I think the latter actually really matters, because Mike, if you told me like CBT is effective, but I'm going to give your kid a book instead, I would say, really? Like, show me why that's effective. I'd quickly, that's why I sort of reacted to that example in that way. So I think it would be illustrative to sort of wrestle with that, whether they were from Alacrity or other examples, and would be a way of sort of testing a flow chart, but also sort of just thinking through, maybe it is often gray and you wouldn't arrive at any definitive answers, but I think it would be an interesting product.
Kevin, you might get the last word.
As I often do. This is a really interesting discussion, and I think the thing I think I'm coming to is that, as a lot of you have said, at heart, like scientifically, maybe there is not an easy distinction because it all so flows together. But then when you want to put a functional form over it or say like, we need to use this for a purpose, Shannon's distinction between the thing and the how is super helpful. And then I feel like Bryan's really eloquent sort of diatribe that sort of really argues like you can have a distinction between the thing and the how, and even if the how modifies how the thing works, it's still a how, right? And so that I just think that was really, so the implementation strategy makes the intervention more effective. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily that you're adapting the intervention. It makes me think of alcohol research. I don't know if y'all have ever tried alcohol before, but you might notice that the effects of alcohol, where we know the mechanisms, many of the mechanisms, right, they're very physiological, but they depend on who you're around, right? So if you're drinking by yourself, you might have a very different subjective experience of drinking than when you're with other people, and that's just a very clear evidence where we know the mechanism, and yet the way that the physiological mechanism impacts our subjective mental health experience differs based on context. And that, I don't know if that totally follows, but that to me was the clearest example I could come up with to illustrate what Bryan is saying, that you can even have things that change how the intervention works in terms of how you deliver or who delivers it or what the context of delivery is, which doesn't necessarily make it an implementation or doesn't make it an intervention change when it's all about implementation. So I just wanted to share those reflections. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Thanks so much for listening, and congratulations on making it through that wall of thought. If you're left feeling confused, well, as you heard, even the experts don't agree on this issue. I can't emphasize enough the need for implementation science to operationalize the two most important constructs in our field. Unless, of course, it doesn't matter. Either way, we want to hear from you. I'm sort of, but not really, on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter at @ISPodcast, and Kevin is at KMKing_psych. Kevin is also on Blue Sky at Kevin M. King. All of the comments and opinions expressed during today's show are our own. They are well-reasoned and insightful, and therefore are probably not endorsed by our grant funders or employers. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Is this an episode of your thing?
I mean, that's the goal. Yeah. I guess if everything falls apart and it's terrible, then maybe we won't make it an episode, but that wouldn't make it any different than any of our other episodes. So